Então, bem-vindos a essa Labô Lecture. E a ideia de receber hoje o professor Stewart Justman, eu já conversei com ele, nenhum livro dele ainda está traduzido para o português, mas é uma honra tê-los todos aqui. Eu estou falando em português, mas a gente vai ter a palestra inteira toda em inglês. E mais uma vez eu peço, fiquem à vontade para colocar as perguntas, as colocações no chat, e se der tempo, e acredito que sim, a gente pode traduzir em português, ou quem quiser fazer a pergunta em inglês. Eu agradeço primeiramente ao grupo da professora Danit, da crise do amadurecimento na contemporaneidade, que vem discutindo esses assuntos que o professor Stewart Justman coloca também, e é hoje responsável pela organização desse evento. Então eu estou vendo Danit, Paula, Renan, Thelma, e tantas pessoas, Ricardo, enfim, várias pessoas do grupo. Eu agradeço muito pelo trabalho de vocês sempre. Cada grupo no Labô tem o seu papel, e eles que são o nosso coração, digamos assim. Então eu agradeço e passo a palavra antes da Danit, nosso diretor acadêmico, Luiz Felipe Pondé. Fala depois ou quer falar alguma coisa agora, Felipe?
I just want to say thank you, Professor Justman. It's really a pleasure, an honor to receive you here, okay? I got you through Frank Furedi. It's him. He made the connection, okay? So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Danit, please.
So, as I said before, Professor Stewart Justman, is a pleasure to welcome you here and to hear you about some ideas that we are discussing in our group. Our group, as surprising as it may seem, is almost completely composed by psychologists and psychoanalysts. And we are discussing in some terms differently than we are seeing elsewhere. So we like some of your ideas. We find out that as so many critics that we have, and you are talking about them. So your books are very interesting to us and to our discussion. So thank you. And we had made a lot of questions. I already said this to you. And thank you for coming and speaking to us.
Professor Stewart Justman has written several books. This one is Fool's Paradise, The Real World of Pop Psychology. And then we have The Nocebo Effect, and then The Psychological Mystique that the group has been studying. And today, the title of the lecture is The Therapeutic Culture. So, Professor Justman, thank you so much.
Okay. Actually, all three of the books you mentioned have something to say about the popularization of psychological constructs, And briefly today, I'm going to give you an example of one such construct, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, can I use that abbreviation, PTSD? And the reason I've chosen this is because in this case, we can actually measure the popularization of it, because PTSD was created in 1980. Before that, it did not exist. And so if we were discussing melancholy, where would you begin? The topic goes back to the ancients, certainly to the Renaissance, but all the way to the ancients. PTSD is different. So we have a baseline of 0, and that is 1980. the diagnosis of PTSD was crafted by Nancy Andreasen, Andreasen. She became the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry. So a very highly placed psychiatrist, and I do not mean to criticize her. I'm crediting her with the authorship of this diagnosis. How many times can you say that, right? Well, here is what she, just one comment before I give you her comment about her own creation. PTSD entered the transformational edition of the DSM. Everybody okay with DSM? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Bible of Psychiatry, the transformational edition, 1980. DSM-3. Let's just leave. Okay, we'll go from there. And what made DSM-3 a departure, well, what was it a departure from? Basically from the Freudian tradition. And so all considerations of etiology, which means causation, were in principle put to one side in favor of pure description, in principle, okay? Now, PTSD is obviously different because there is causation. Your troubles originate in a trauma. They are caused by a trauma. And PTSD found its way into DSM-3, not by the usual route through committees and this elaborate process of bureaucratic construction, which there's been a lot of good study of, but through another mechanism entirely. It was lobbied into DSM-3 by Vietnam veterans with the assistance of a couple of well-placed psychiatrists. And the connection between PTSD and the Vietnam War was so close that originally, before it went on the books, it was known as post-Vietnam syndrome. Okay. Because it has this connection with etiology, causation, my troubles are caused by a trauma I suffered in war. This is obviously very different from most mental disorders that are described in the DSM-3. So I would think of it as, originally it must have seemed a kind of footnote to the DSM system, an outlying diagnosis. Turned out to be much more than that. This then is what Nancy Andreasen, the author of the diagnosis, said about it. Once the diagnosis of PTSD became available after the publication of DSM-3 in 1980, just as I said, it quickly enjoyed widespread use, often in ways that were not anticipated. The genie was out of the bottle. Genio. The genie was out of the bottle, meaning that something happened which was irreversible and unpredictable. In English, we also have an expression, the cat was out of the bag. The cat was out of the bag. 1980, it went on the books. So let's cut to 1988. Only 8 years has this diagnosis been in existence. Only 8 years. In 1988, the United States Congress authorized the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. So I think there was a lot of proverbial reports that Vietnam veterans were adjusting poorly. They were having difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, adjusting. So a study was made in which they were surveyed. The results of the survey were astonishing. The survey, 1988, found that 53% of all men who served in the Vietnam War developed PTSD by their own report. This is self-reported PTSD. Got that? 53%. The problem is only 15% ever served in combat units. Only 15% ever saw combat, but 53% claimed to suffer, reported themselves as suffering PTSD. How are we to make sense of this? Back up for 1 second. The total number, 1 million men claim to have suffered PTSD in the Vietnam War. That's the magnitude of what we're talking about. So this is not a small issue. The genie is out of the bottle. That's what that's 1 million men. The genie is out of the bottle. How does one make sense of this? These men were not, my best understanding of this is that these men were not trying to claim compensation under fraudulent pretenses. There's nothing like that. They were answering a survey. They were not applying for benefits. They were not seeking to be accredited as PTSD sufferers, okay? They were simply reporting their own understanding. They understood themselves. So this is amazing. PTSD now is available not only for psychiatrists or medical or other medical doctors to use diagnosing people, patients, it's for patients or people in general to use to diagnose themselves. And I should have asked you, Andrea, to post my graphic, please. Can you post that?
Sure, of course.
So this will give you an idea of the uptake of PTSD, of the diagnosis in the medical literature. So
can you see it? Can you see it?
I can see fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So from 1980 is the year of inception. Take a look at 1988. You can see it's already catching on in the medical literature, but this is a lecture about popularization. And to become popular means that it's being taken up by the population itself. And this is exactly what happened with, okay? So this is a graph of what happens in the medical literature, and something perhaps far more dramatic is happening invisibly. You can't look it up in a bibliography, on a search engine. This comes from one of the major medical databases in the United States. It's like a PubMed search. There you go, Medline. It's like a PubMed search. Okay, thank you. Can we take that down? So at this point, by 1988, only 8 years after the creation of the diagnosis, it's already in the cultural water system. It's there for everybody to drink up, to draw upon. It's a resource. Even people who have not actually been exposed to trauma can somehow come to believe that they have. Maybe they thought, I don't know, maybe they thought they were so traumatized they couldn't remember. I'm going to come back to this. Because that became a popular notion, that trauma wipes out the memory of trauma. How about that? We'll get to that in a second. So only 8 years in, 1 million people who have not actually been exposed to the trauma of war can nevertheless believe that they have been. And drawing now on a clinical psychologist who I think the world of at Harvard, who I corresponded with in certain ways, Richard McNally, whose conclusions I've been borrowing without giving him credit. His notion is that most of these 1 million people believe they have PTSD because it explains their problems. Etiology, there's a cause behind their problems. So they are attributing their problems to some trauma that was suffered with or without their knowledge in the Vietnam War. Now, I would suggest to the psychoanalysts, psychologists in the audience, it's not a good idea to attribute your problems to a non-existent cause. Okay? Counter-therapeutic. This is the kind of thing that happens when people start diagnosing themselves, and Andrea, my most recent book, the one that you held up on the nocebo effect, goes into, so does not, I think, discuss this. I think. I don't read my books after I publish them, so I'm not a really good authority on them, but in that book, I do discuss some of the mischief that follows from self-diagnosis.
You do discuss that.
PTSD?
Yeah, not exactly, but all the symptoms, yeah.
Okay, now we're going to cut to 2010, 2012. In 2012, I think I could say that the most hated, I'm going to talk about the most hated man in the United States. He was a football coach, American football. Football coach at a big football power, Pennsylvania State University, who was accused of, prosecuted for, convicted of, and imprisoned as a result of all this. He was accused of sexually molesting at least 10 or 12 young men, not 6 or 8 or 9 years old, 16, 18, or 19 years old. His name was Jerry Sandusky, S-A-N-D-U-S-K-Y, Sandusky. The astonishing thing about this case, he's in prison to this day. The astonishing thing about this case is that not one of the victims who accused him and who took the witness stand in his trial, not one of them ever offered any suggestion that he had ever done anything like this until they underwent psychotherapy. And it was psychotherapy at the hands of a therapist who believed religiously in the concept of repressed and recovered memories. There was no evidence of any kind of abuse except for these recovered memories. And there are no transcripts of the therapy sessions. There are no notes, no records of any kind, of anything that happened in the therapy sessions. So I would suggest that this has been, it's as if the privileges of the confessional, the privacy of the confessional, the traditional privacy of a priest's confession has been transferred to the therapist, who now has who can operate in complete secrecy. And in English, and I don't know if it's the same in Portuguese, I would guess perhaps that it is. In English, there's a close etymological connection between the sacred and the secret.
Yes, it's the same.
Right. And so the idea is that something sacred, extremely secret, is happening in this therapy session where these men, one after another, are being led to believe that they underwent, in one case, hundreds of incidents. A man was supposedly raped by Sandusky hundreds of times with no recollection of it whatsoever. This defies all knowledge of psychiatry, all empirical knowledge of psychology. So Sandusky was convicted. In the United States, that means that a jury heard this case. There were 12 people on the jury. In order for me to be convicted of a crime, all 12 people must agree. All verdicts are unanimous in the American jury system. 12 out of 12, 100%. That's what the notion of trauma does. So 1988, we had this notion of trauma being taken up by 1 million men, most of whom never saw combat, but believed for some reason and rather deeply that they had been traumatized. In 2010, 2012, Sandusky is convicted by a jury, which finds it completely believable that somebody could be raped, a man could be raped by another man hundreds of times with no memory of it whatsoever, because somehow this notion got attached to PTSD. And Nancy Andreessen doesn't believe that. But the popularization of PTSD made that notion available to the general populace. Okay. Just the other day in the United States, last Friday, I think it was, the student senate at universities and colleges, the students typically have their own governing bodies with some degree of power, perhaps, or at least the power to express the will of the student body. And I'm now talking about Cornell University. It's one of the Ivy League, one of the top tier of colleges in the United States. Their student senate voted unanimously again. There we go, unanimously, that all courses should have on their syllabus, a syllabus is like a reading list. Okay, I don't know what the word is in Portuguese.
Ementa. Ementa da disciplina. Okay, I translated it, don't worry.
Okay, that all courses should have on their syllabus a trigger warning, which is a term in English. That is, students should be warned in advance about any possibly traumatizing material. Now the question is, what's traumatizing material? But I would just say that at this point, if I'm guessing that at this point in the United States, most classes already at every institution of higher learning have these warnings. The concept of trauma, which was introduced in 1980, has been completely institutionalized. It's not just in the cultural water system now, it's in print on probably just about every syllabus. So let me just give one example of what this sort of, the effect this sort of thing could have, and then I'll stop. So I was actually, I entered this, this business as a teacher of lit. It's my original love. It's the books of my own that I love the best, my firstborn. And one of the books that I most loved to teach over the years, and I must have taught it 20 times at least, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's last novel. His last and indisputably his greatest novel. So it's hard to say exactly where the story of the Brothers Karamazov begins, but if I had to pinpoint it, I would say this. Fyodor Karamazov, the father of the Karamazov clan, raped a woman. The woman was an idiot. That's, you know, Dostoevsky has a novel called The Idiot, right? Probably a similar word in Portuguese. The Idiot.
The same thing, yeah.
Right. And this woman was an idiot. She had the mind of a child and was wandering, whatever the story. Okay, so Fyodor raped this idiot. And of that act, his own murderer was born. But 24 years after that act, he was murdered by the child who was born of that act. And I can't say that in teaching this novel, I ever really discussed this incident. It has a chapter in the novel. It speaks for itself. And I think I never really had much to say about it. And I never once had a student say that he or she was traumatized by reading it. Never. But I will tell you that I am retired now, but there's a university 4 streets away from me where I worked. If I were teaching today, I would not even attempt to do it. I could not possibly do it. I would be inviting students to claim that I had traumatized them by teaching the Brothers Karamazov, at the bottom of which lies a story about rape. That is what has become of this national now preoccupation with trauma that began in 1980. So I will, there are some of the points that I was planning to bring up, but I think I'll leave those aside. I've gone for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. Let's call that a day, and we could just discuss from here.
Perfect. Okay? Thank you so much, Professor. It was excellent, and I think we face the same issues, we face the same dilemmas and questions, and I am sure that, well, we have the same things, we face the same problems, and when we talk about Dostoevsky and when you talk about these books and everything, we are, well, it's the same thing. So, Danit, would you like me to ask the questions, or would you like to say something before?
Yes, before we have other questions, I want also to explain to Professor Justman, yes, ethology is very important for us, yes, because we know that descriptions is only some kind of a description. So, you know, you are describing the water when you drink water. So it's like nothing. And of course, and what I think it was very special to when hearing about the PTSD is the idea of trauma as the idea of surfing in the wave of diagnosis, of this self-diagnosis, entering the same way, like a cultural expansion, and keeping the idea in a kind of popular way, and working for everything. So, and this leads us to I will make my first question. Okay,
please.
So because it's trauma and diagnosis, and we know that there is a kind of trail, a kind of fast track today of the mental health market. So my question, and what we are discussing in our group and understanding what's going on, trying to understand what's going on, is about this fast track is more and more useful to a mental health market. So I want to ask you if you also agree that is the mental health market the new frontier of the capital in this 21st century?
Wow. Okay. So I've tried to not just argue, but show that PTSD was popularized. Americans have a slang expression from 0 to 60. It refers to cars, the speed of a car. 0 is when you're stopped. 60 miles an hour is when you're going down the highway at full speed. PTSD went from 0 to 60. But about 20 years before that, it's funny, you use the term mental health. In 1960, the American public did not buy the concept of mental health. They had to be argued into it and persuaded into it. It was a controversial topic. And only after decades of crusading was the concept of mental health fully, well, I guess you could say institutionalized. Your question made reference to the health marketplace. I was trying to find the best estimate I can come up with on just the number of people in the United States who are in the mental health business. How about that? Okay. A few years ago, a good, well-researched number was 1.7 million. So yeah, let's say somewhere a little short of 2 million people in the United States are in the mental health business. Only 100,000 of those are clinical psychologists, PhDs. Only 100,000. Psychiatrists, I would think, even fewer. So Nancy Andreessen was a psychiatrist who authored PTSD. But I think then PTSD took on a life of its own. It escaped the bottle, took on a life of its own, and it is now, I think, the darling of psychologists, social workers, and just miscellaneous psychotherapists. I don't know how it is in Brazil, but in the United States, I think if you just put a sign on your window saying psychotherapist, you're a psychotherapist. It's not licensed. A clinical psychologist, yes, that's licensed. A psychiatrist with a medical degree, yes, of course, that's licensed. A social worker, yes, you have some kind of credential. But what about the people in the Sandusky case? Those psychotherapists, and they have names. People that we know who they are. What kind of credential, who are these people? So of the just short of 2 million people in the mental health industry in the United States, most of those are not people who hold an advanced degree or a license. And one of the things that went through my own head when I was going through my own presentation was, where are the voices crying out against this abuse of the DSM? And the DSM was not the product of fools by any means. Nancy Andreessen was not by any means a fool. And the graphic that I asked you to put up, Andrea, and was up for a minute or so, if you look at the attribution, the two authors I got it from are psychiatrists. Really, really good ones. There you go. Very skeptical of the abuse, Paul McHugh especially, very skeptical of the abuse of PTSD. But a minority voice for sure, and one would like to think that the mental health industry, I don't want to say professions, that the mental health industry was capable of more self-criticism than we've seen. Unfortunately, this trauma has just been a blessing for, can I use that word? That word, okay? A blessing for the mental health industry. And that may in itself explain why we don't hear criticism of this overextension of the notion of trauma to the point where it's on the syllabus of it's on the reading list of basically every course in the United States. It's probably even on the syllabus in the hard sciences.
Probably, yeah.
Possible as that seems. But this is reality where the impossible becomes actual.
Yes. And here in Brazil, we have the life coaches. As in the United States, Professor, life coaches that are coaches, that you talk about in your book about Fool's Paradise, those people that write self-help books and life coaches that consider themselves therapists as well. So it's like A disease.
They are in that census of the mental health industry in the United States, 1.7, 1.8 million, something like that. Life coaches are among them. There are tens of thousands in the United States. They're in the tens of thousands.
I think here it's the same, I think. Well, I have a question. Well, we have so many questions. I don't know if it's going to be possible to ask all of them, but I'm going to do my best. So, Professor, there is like a cultural shift, a culture shift, where the self became more important than anything else. Any idea, and why did this happen? According to the PTSD from the 1980s, from here, this culture shift, what do you attribute to that?
So what was the question?
The question is that there is a cultural shift where the self became more important than anything else. And what is your opinion about it? And why did this happen?
Oh boy, that's a big one.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, Frank Furedi has, I recommend his books. He's a very penetrating thinker, I think.
Yeah.
I do find him repetitive. I'll be frank with you. I think his writing is repetitive and undisciplined. However, very provocative, very penetrating, and I did invite him to attend this meeting today. He has another commitment. Frank would say, and I agree, there was a time when what I did in my working life was I was a professor, and originally a professor of literature. So I'm teaching the wisdom of the past, the achievements of the past, which I believed in. I still believe in. I said the Brothers Karamazov. What did I say? It's unquestionably Dostoevsky's greatest book. Are there people out there who are reckless enough to say that the Brothers Karamazov really ought to be, everything in the past ought to be burned? It is a curse. The past is an inheritance that curses us. Let us be rid of it. Burn it. Bonfire. They don't say it, but that's the message that is today in the ascendant. So if the past is gone, what's left? What's left is the self, I suppose. And Frank would say, and I agree, that the self in itself does not, we're not freestanding entities.
Absolutely, yeah.
In ourselves, I mean, there is not enough there to support, a meaningful existence without a world around us, a culture in which we are rooted, and a past which we inherit, all of which I believe in profoundly. Do away with those things, do away with the past, do away with the culture, what's left? Well, the patient. The patient then diagnoses himself or herself. Patient becomes invested in a diagnosis. What's the difference between being invested and being over-invested in a diagnosis? Good question. And then that's how we are where we are today.
Thank you. There is another question that we talk about, that you talk about, the placebo effect, the nocebo effect, the pop psychology, positive psychology, life medicalization, the medicalization of life. Would all of this be expressions of a return to magic and animism?
Yeah. In one of my other identities, I do write about the placebo effect, which I don't believe. I don't know how deeply we want to go into this, but I don't believe it is an optical illusion necessarily. It is certainly verifiable. There's even a physiological basis for it. And so it is not just humbug or nonsense necessarily, okay? But, I think some of my better known publications are on the placebo effect, and I mean, I've written in medical journals and so on. However, one thing that I disapprove of in the placebo literature is the neglect of the nocebo effect. Medicine is too much into positive thinking. You know, doctors, and if I were an MD, I would want to exploit the placebo effect too, of course, right? And there are very legitimate ways to do that, to establish trust, right? To build, to promote reassurance and trust. Sure, you can do that within the practice of good medicine. But if the placebo effect is powerful, which it undoubtedly is, the nocebo effect is equally powerful. It's the other side of the coin. And it is almost totally neglected. You should see what the graphs look like. You know, the graph on the placebo effect is way up here, and the graph on the nocebo effect is way down there. Medicine is not interested in it. Hugely dangerous for that reason. No. And so, you know, my notion is that, to kind of come back to where we are, when diagnoses, not just PTSD, but all the other household words, depression, of course, when they are in the cultural water system, and they are very much that in the United States. You know Brazil better than I do. I don't know it at all. They're very much in the water system in the United States, very much available for uptake, and therefore people diagnose. I used to have students come into me in class and announce their diagnosis to me. I have ADHD.
Everybody does that in Brazil. Yeah, everybody does that in Brazil as well.
ADHD was created, guess when, people? What's the magic year? 1980. It was called ADD, right? In 1980, it was ADD. Now it's ADHD. Several years ago, 5 or more years ago, 20% of American boys, 20% of all American boys were diagnosed with this nonsense. What does it mean to carry around a belief that your brain is faulty? What does it mean to grow up with the belief as you're forming your understanding of yourself? I'm speaking to psychoanalysts, psychologically minded people in the audience. It's poisonous. But this is what the popularization of these disorders has done. You know?
Yes.
Don't. I'll just leave it at that. So we have disorders from A to Z available for people who are looking for some source of meaning, because after all, they don't believe in their culture, they don't inherit from the past, their family may have disintegrated. Well, maybe this should be regarded as some sort of like a form of meaning. Well, now I understand myself. I have PTSD. I have ADHD. I'm special. I'm traumatized. At least I'm special in some way. I'm depressed. Another diagnosis. That's the most popular diagnosis since DSM-3 came along, by the way. Depression, which is, you know, a very marketable diagnosis, and the only diagnosis of the ones that I've mentioned, which has a pharmaceutical remedy, right out there. Lots of pharmaceutical antidepressants on the market. Right?
Yeah.
Just a moment, Andrea.
Sure.
I want only to share with Professor Justman that here one of the most popular diagnoses that pops like this is autism.
Autism, yeah.
Yeah, so autism. Why? because if you discover when you get to 50 years old that you have been you are an artist for that's why you are so intelligent, because it's not it's not the more the
negative,
most,
yeah,
the
something
serious
negative.
one. You are the Asperger. So this means that you are very, very smart, very, very
Asperger.
intelligent. Yeah.
Neglected genius.
Yeah.
But when back in the 1960s, I remember I once worked at a place for autistic children. And in those times, autism meant the child was sitting in the corner and could not communicate. It was outside of language, did not speak, and did not respond when spoken to, and that was autism. So autism has now been completely transformed.
Yes, this is one of the consequences of this trick of this difference now in the SM. They enlarge the spectrum of autism. So now you have different levels, but everyone is autist. So
is that expression in Portuguese, on the spectrum? In
yes.
English, say that, you hear that, I'm on the autism spectrum, on the spectrum.
Yes, autism
Even it's becoming completely colloquial. It's colloquial speech. It's again in the water system. Asperger's has, in the United States, Asperger's connotes connotation, connotes some kind of genius or something like genius, right? So it's a gift. In other words, it's a gift, but it's a gift that's too subtle for society to recognize. So it's a way that you can be, again, in a bad world, in a world where you don't believe in your culture, you don't believe in your society, you may or may not be attached to your family, but you can have this gift within, and there may be corresponding or similar reasons for people's investment in other diagnoses. I'm ADHD, I learn, but I learn in a unique way. So I have a kind of unique ability or something like that. I don't fit into the regular boxes. I'm special. I'm a round peg and you're trying to hammer me into a square hole.
Yes.
I'm special. You hear a lot of that. And I mean, I understand that. And when students came up and told me that when I was a professor, I didn't lecture them or anything. And I did, I filed it away in my mind for sure. And I tried not to react, overreact or anything as a professor. And basically I tried to disregard it, and just, and not to change my expectation of the student at all, because I would think that would be unfair, unwise, to form the expectation that this student was really incapable of learning. And I got that sort of thing when I was teaching classes on the placebo effect, reading medical literature, just reading one medical paper after another. There were students who would come up to me and tell me about their learning disabilities. Wow.
Yeah, that's the same thing here. We're talking, there's a question here about social media, that how do you see the trivialization of psychological diseases? Of course, like we are talking here, attention deficit disorder, everything, but in relation to social media, youngsters, mostly millennials and Generation Z, seem dependent on a diagnosis to call this attention. And especially, I'm going to add something to this question from Jason, that they add this on their social media profile. Yes, this is a kind of a glamorization of that. Don't you think, Professor?
Interesting. So in the United States, we talk about identity politics.
Yeah, that's it.
Usually that means racial identity. It's kind of a code word for racial identity. But I think that that diagnosis is a way that you can have an identity that's outside of race. However, as you see in my nocebo book, I don't think it's a great thing for people to invest in a diagnosis. You know, for me, that is a formula for the nocebo effect. You know, a diagnosis should be something you don't want to have. I would rather not be depressed. I would rather not be traumatized. To embrace my trauma, even to find trauma where perhaps it isn't there, because it does such a good job of explaining what is there, right? Don't we reason backwards with trauma? The trauma explains the symptom. So if I have symptoms, I must have the trauma. That sort of overinvestment, that identity, I am traumatized, so I'm going to put that on my profile on Facebook. To me, well, it may get you friends, which is a good thing, I suppose. You may find like-minded people. Okay. I guess we're all entitled to that. But you could also increase your investment in just a mistake. What if you're like those veterans I referred to in 1988, 1 million of whom claimed to suffer PTSD, when only about 100,000 of that 1 million ever saw combat? Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. There is an excerpt of your book that I posted, that I wrote down here on the chat, that you can see. People can download it and buy it from Kindle, from Amazon here, from that. This is the trauma effect, that you say that labels like prized possession not only set patterns of treatment, but shape expectations, a mediator of outcomes, and mobilize symptoms. Yes? What do you mean by this mobilization of symptoms?
Oh, did I write that?
Yes, beautiful. I'm not inventing that. I'm not, no, that's it.
Well, I don't know. Let's say that you are diagnosed with depression, which is massively overdiagnosed in the United States. I don't want to necessarily go into that, but I don't think that's a controversial position. It is overdiagnosed. Let's say that I am overdiagnosed. Let's say that I am suffering from some transient sadness. This happens, and that I am diagnosed with clinical depression. So how can the diagnosis inflame my sadness? I guess would be the question, right? Or how can it magnify my sadness? Well, maybe instead of attempting to overcome my sadness, maybe go out and exercise, or just try to rise above it. If I am convinced that I am overwhelmingly sad, and I have every right to be overwhelmingly sad, and that my identity is as a sad person, then I am going to give myself to sadness. And that might be one example. It's not the best example.
No, okay. Okay. There is a question. What do you think about the declarations of Dr. Ellen Francis concerning the DSM-5?
Yeah, I'm very impressed by them. But what is most impressive is that he was the editor of DSM-4. Did you not know? So Robert Spitzer was the editor of DSM-3. Alan Francis of DSM-4. And then we have DSM-5, but the arch critic, the biggest critic of DSM-5 was the guy who was the editor of DSM-4. And Alan Francis has condemned the overdiagnosis of many conditions, including those that I've named. He's condemned diagnostic inflation, a term that I had not used, but is certainly worth checking on in the medical literature itself. And in an article I am just finishing right now, at the end of that article where I try to bring everything to a conclusion, I rely on Alan Francis. And specifically, his proposal that before an MD, whether a general practitioner or a psychiatrist, before an MD diagnoses depression, there should be a waiting period of, I don't remember, a couple of months, because 50% of the time, the diagnosis clears, the condition clears by itself. So before you lock the diagnosis in, before you lock the depression in with a diagnosis, which can change it precisely by naming it and arousing the expectations of the patient. There's something wrong with my brain. I am depressed. There's something wrong with my neurotransmitters. I am depressed. Before doing that, if you wait a couple of months, so Alan Francis suggests, it would be a good idea. So in the most recent thing that I'm working on, I am ending on that very note. But to me, why does he suggest that? If a diagnosis did not have an effect on the patient, why wouldn't you diagnose the patient right off the bat? The patient's depressed, diagnose depression. The patient ticks the DSM-3 boxes, the patient is depressed, diagnose the patient. Why would you not do that unless diagnosis potentially had some adverse consequences, potentially? Risks and benefits. Mm-hmm. A good doctor thinks like that, right? About risks and benefits. And you haven't mentioned a couple of my books I've written have been reviewed in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the two leading medical journals in the United States. They're strictly on medical matters, not on any of the matters that we're talking about today. And I think it's most important for doctors to be thinking of risks while they are diagnosing and, of course, especially treating.
Okay. There's a very interesting question here about how do you explain the increasing number of parents in the US diagnosing their children with gender dysphoria? Are those parents in search of meaning or belonging as well?
I don't know. It is, when I go back and take a look at when I said I don't read my own books after I publish them, and I don't. But when I scan a chapter or something like that from the book in 2015, when gender dysphoria was not a topic in the United States, no, I don't know. I don't think I'd heard of it, maybe, but it was certainly not a topic, certainly not a hot topic, and it had not. I mix my metaphors. It had not gotten into the cultural water system. Well, it's into the water system now. And how it happened so fast, I truly don't know. It's an astonishing example of a concept that went from obscurity to popularity very, very quickly. And I think that European countries have devised, the UK, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, have devised good, careful ways. By careful, I mean mindful of possible harms. Because to me, the practice of medicine means being mindful of possible harms. These countries have developed responsible ways of dealing with gender dysphoria and everything that follows from it. I don't think we're there in the United States.
Okay.
Why many parents have many parents in the United States bought into gender dysphoria? I don't know. They may just be afraid of being stigmatized.
Yes.
Because you will be stigmatized if you dare to question, let alone oppose anything connected with gender dysphoria. So it might be fear. I don't really know.
Yes. I think it's the same thing, I think, here in Brazil. Yes, Danita, I think it's the same idea, yeah?
Yes, it's the same. Frank Furedi have written about this paranoid parenting. It means yes, it's we have read this book, and it was very important for us to try to understand why parents are so damaged at the point to go into this kind of solution or this kind of diagnose without being in contact with their intuition or protecting their children to go. Yes,
to protect your children. American parents, I generalize, very reluctant to assert parental authority. I mean, the word authority does not have good connotations. It lost its good connotations decades ago in the United States, and parental authority too. Have you heard of Dr. Spock? He wrote what is probably the biggest selling book of all time in the United States, the biggest selling book ever, How to Bring Up Your Baby. It's called Baby and Child Care. And when I was a baby, his book was just in first edition. And so as I grew up, his book was go through more and more editions. And he has been blamed for permissive parenting. It's a bit of an exaggeration. He did not believe entirely in permissive parenting. He did believe in parental authority. It's interesting. But since then, parental authority has really gotten a bad name, and there are very few, I think, parents who are willing to assert their authority. It's my duty as a parent to protect you. Because I love you, it is my duty to protect you. That sounds like, to most Americans, that sounds like an old-fashioned thing to say. And I must say, I brought up two children. I felt that way, certainly. I don't think that I ever had to really, I can't think offhand. I mean, I set deadlines. I mean, you have to come home at a certain time. That sort of thing. Yeah, you set rules, but nothing much more than that. I'm not sure that how many parents believe in the United States that it is their duty to protect their child and also to protect their child from going wrong, from taking a wrong turn.
Mm-hmm. We have a very short question, but very Well, a deep one. Is therapy the new religion? Do you think therapy is the new religion?
Well, I said before that when I talked very briefly about the Sandusky affair, right, that football coach who is in prison right now, that there are no records, written tapes, nothing, no records of anything that happened in the therapy sessions where people who never claimed that they were abused were suggested into believing that they had been abused. Something happened. And I said that the therapist believed religiously.
Yes.
It wasn't really playing around with language. He did. I think that is a sacred truth. For that therapist, I think it is sacred. And I do think therapy is becoming a debased religion. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I wish that more clergymen, priests, pastors stood up and made their voices heard to take religion back. Let's go back to about 1960. DSM-3, 1980. Let's go back to 1960. The American public did not have the phrase mental health. That was not an established, it wasn't even an established term at that point, much less an established concept. Did people seek help and advice? Where did they go? Before they went to therapists, where did they go? Of course they sought help and advice. They went to their clergyman. Overwhelmingly, they went to their clergyman and their medical doctor. A lot of people went to their medical doctors for advice. General practitioner, do you have that expression?
Yes, clínico geral, yeah.
Yeah. GP in the UK. Or you had a general practitioner for years and years. Sort of the family had a general practitioner. You took your problems. It was common to get advice from that person. Also, though, from a clergyman, a trusted source of wisdom. And I wish I heard more clergymen today coming out and saying, people shouldn't be running to their therapists necessarily. There are other sources of advice and, advice, counsel, wisdom, help, friendship
Yes,
in this world besides therapists. Therapists are the newcomers. This is an industry. It's new. But when doctors and clergymen gave advice, it wasn't an industry. It was a tradition. In fact, even writing advice books is a tradition. I mean, in Fool's Paradise, I look into the pop psychology books on the market, some of the big ones. But Americans know that in the 1730s, 300 years ago, Benjamin Franklin wrote advice literature. Very readable. It's kind of wonderful, actually. It's common sense. And it's nothing like the advice literature that we're used to today. So the idea that advice should displace religion, take the place of religion, that is a new concept, and I wish I saw people who were invested in religion, priests, speaking out against it. But I don't hear that. I don't hear it. I don't see it.
Yes. And one last question. Do you think that big companies are accelerating this process of recognizing disorders as personal identities. For example, recently there was a situation involving the company M&M's that created a character who was anxious. And this fusion between disorder identities and big companies is going to increase. They are accelerating this process of recognizing disorders.
So what was the company that created?
M&M's, the chocolate. Do you know?
Oh, I heard about that. So
Yeah.
it was an anxious little M&M.
Yes. Yes.
Did people think it was funny?
No, I think the people were disturbed about it. Yes, that there was a character of an M&M that was anxious.
I wish I knew more about that. So it was somebody's bright idea of a marketing ploy, a marketing trick, right?
Yes, yes. As far as I know, I don't know if anybody has more information about it. Please write it down. But as far as I know, Samuel, that you wrote down, if you want to put something else.
Were they saying instead of going to therapy, just eat your M&Ms?
I don't.
This is a cure, or is it just a?
I think the character that they invented, because all of the M&Ms, depending on the color, I think they represent something. So, for example, there is a color that represents women, and people are not supposed to identify that color with a woman because now everything is gender fluid. So, you know that this idea that you do not have to label these things. I think it's more or less like this.
Well, once, I mean, that completes my argument about popularization, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at least we don't have an ADHD M&M.
All right.
Maybe we do. I don't know. Is it impossible? Don't say impossible.
No. Yeah, an M&M with PTSD, an M&M with Asperger, and everything like that. Yeah. Okay. The character, and Samuel is saying that the character that was created was anxious, relating its appearance and personality, and everybody made a fuss about it. You know that. I don't know. There was some triggers. There were some triggers that were involved with that.
Gosh, I wish I knew more about it. Was it? Did M&M's? Did the company apologize for this and say we made a mistake?
I don't know. Samuel, would you like to talk and explain the situation? I'm going to let you talk here. You can open your microphone and then you explain the situation. Weird. You can open your microphone. Wait, he's asking for a minute, but I think he's going to talk and to explain this wonderful example that we have, the illustration. Well, we have so many examples nowadays. Everything that you talked, Professor, there are so many examples in Brazil as well concerning this literature and trigger warnings. And I'm going to say that one of our favorite books at our lab is Dostoevsky, the Brothers Karamazov as well, okay? But Samuel is going to open the microphone, please.
Hello, I'm here, sorry, because I was in my class, but this moment I can speak. So the situation, the M&M's, the company created a series of characters related with identity. So it was, for example, a lesbian character, an anxious character, and after a lot of critics that was made after the situation, the company gave a step back and posted an apologize, explaining, oh, sorry, we didn't know that a simple image and a simple character will cause all this damage. So they had a step back, but the situation is like that.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Thank you so much for your explanation.
You know, the idea that a funny advertising campaign can be damaging, right? Somehow, the idea that we all have very fragile selves, that fragility is the is our most important trait has also become popularized. And over, I don't know, 50 years, the pendulum has swung completely. And instead of being, resilient and adaptive, we are now supposed to be fragile and traumatized or something like that. Can you make people more fragile by telling them they're fragile over and over again? You can make them more brittle. We have that expression in the United States. It means brittle means that you are easily offended, more easily offended. And I think students over the past few years in American universities have become much, much more brittle than they were. Not a good thing. So I mean, the fact that we're talking about a funny little advertising campaign where the manufacturer had to end up, how does every story end now? With an apology, right? I mean, if Dostoevsky were alive, he would now apologize for having written the Brothers Karamazov. How else, right? What else can you do? The fundamental assumption that we are easily traumatized, broken, depressed, whatever, made anxious, it strikes me as a dangerous and unhealthy assumption. Not that we should be cultivating our strengths, not our weaknesses. What does it mean to cultivate a weakness? Well, I tried to write a book about that. That's that 2015 book.
Great.
Right.
So we would like to thank you so much Professor for being here. We are going to be in touch with you because we can, for example, Danit, translate his articles maybe into Portuguese.
I think it's a very good idea.
Yeah, yes, I think, yes. So, Professor, thank you so much. Danit, would you like to say our final words here?
Thank you very much, Professor, to bring to us new thoughts and things that we can think about it, and clarifying some feelings and some obstacles that we are facing in our clinical work. And this is the most important thing. Also socially and also clinically, we are seeing this, we are observing this. So it's very important to have this organized and very, in this way, to think about it is very important to us. And so thank you. And it's a very good idea to translate your works, and we are going to talk about this, Andrea.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is, yeah. Would you like to say something else? Ops. Acho que ele saiu. Já foi embora. Então, meus queridos, boa noite. Muito obrigada. Até a próxima. Um beijo. Tchau, tchau.